April 17, 1945. The war in Europe was burning itself out, but in the Bavarian foothills the smoke of battle still clung to the valleys like a shroud. A German field hospital, little more than a collection of white canvas tents stained with blood and mud, sat trembling under the distant rumble of artillery. Inside, nurses in grey, wear-marked uniforms worked with mechanical precision, their faces hollowed by exhaustion. They had learned to ignore the sound of engines, the thunder of shells, the cries of wounded men who believed the Reich still had a chance. But on that spring afternoon, something different approached. The roar of unfamiliar engines, low and steady, the grinding of treads that did not belong to German panzers, came from the west. Shadows of olive-drab vehicles crawled across the hills. The Americans had come. The nurses braced themselves for brutality. They had been told what to expect. Propaganda whispered in their ears for years that Americans were ruthless invaders, that women would be dragged from hospitals, that mercy was a luxury the enemy did not grant. Fear, cold and electric, gripped the tent as helmets with white stars appeared in the doorway. Rifles pointed inward, sharp eyes scanned the cots and the shivering staff. For a moment the world stopped. Then something unexpected happened. The weapons lowered. Voices, stern but controlled, ordered the medics forward. Instead of pulling the nurses away in chains, the Americans beckoned them toward the wounded, both German and American alike. The prisoners were not to be humiliated. They were to be enlisted in the business of life. The nurses exchanged looks of disbelief. This was not what they had been prepared for. They expected jeers, punishment, degradation. Instead, gloved hands gestured for them to continue their work. American officers spoke through interpreters. "Help us treat them. Your knowledge is valuable. These men need care." The words fell like thunderclaps in the silence. For the first time in years, the nurses felt something stirring that had long been buried: professional duty, the instinct to save rather than to obey a collapsing ideology. Outside, the battlefield still seethed. Smoke columns twisted skyward, punctured by the staccato of machine guns. German soldiers, bloodied and desperate, stumbled back from broken lines, expecting only captivity or death. But within the walls of the makeshift hospital, a strange transformation was taking place. Instead of harsh commands from collapsing German officers, the women now heard the calm, clipped tones of American medics, directing them toward triage stations. Instead of hiding supplies from air raids, they found themselves supplied with morphine bandages and plasma. In the middle of chaos, an unlikely alliance was forged. For the Americans, the decision was pragmatic yet humane. Every pair of skilled hands meant lives saved. Their own medics were stretched thin by the relentless push eastward. The German nurses, hardened by years of treating battlefield trauma, represented a reservoir of experience too valuable to waste. And so the conquerors did the unthinkable. They ordered their prisoners not to stand down but to step up. For the Germans, the experience was jarring, almost surreal. The same enemy that had destroyed their towns, crushed their armies, and now held their lives in its grasp, was demanding that they continue healing. Yet this demand carried no cruelty, no mockery. It was a command rooted in respect for life itself. Some of the nurses hesitated, their hands trembling as they changed dressings on American soldiers. Would these men curse them? Would they spit? But the wounded groaned with the same human fragility as their own countrymen, and in that moment, the uniform no longer mattered. A bullet wound in a GI's shoulder looked no different from one torn into a German infantryman's thigh. Flesh was flesh, blood was blood. The battlefield's only common language was pain, and the nurses knew it fluently. As dusk fell, lanterns glowed inside the tent, throwing long shadows against canvas walls. Outside, American guards kept watch, rifles slung loosely but eyes alert. Inside, the rhythm of medicine resumed. The clink of metal basins, the hiss of morphine syringes, the rustle of gauze. It was as if the war itself had been locked out of that small space, replaced by a fragile sanctuary of duty and compassion. The nurses, still captives, found themselves at once liberated from the crushing weight of propaganda. Their captors did not demand allegiance to a flag or salute to a Führer. They demanded something greater: humanity. Whispers spread among the women. Could this be trusted? Was it some cruel trick? a way to shame them before execution. But the longer the night wore on, the clearer the truth became. The Americans truly wanted them to save lives, even the lives of those who had only hours earlier tried to kill them. Each suture tied, each wound dressed, each transfusion monitored was a silent rebellion against the war itself. The irony was inescapable. These women had spent years under orders from a regime obsessed with death, sacrifice, and destruction. Now, under the watch of the enemy, they were finally free to fulfill the oath that had first led them to nursing school, to preserve life. The walls of the tent echoed not with hatred, but with determination. Outside, artillery fire marked the dying convulsions of the Third Reich. Inside, every heartbeat salvaged was a quiet defiance of its madness. One nurse, Anna, found herself tending to an American sergeant with shrapnel embedded in his leg. He groaned in pain, his eyes half closed. She worked carefully, flushing the wound, applying clamps. For years she had been told that this man would see her as an enemy, as prey, yet when his eyes fluttered open, he whispered through cracked lips, "Danke," the single word, spoken in her own language, shattered the last of her fears. That night, the hospital became a symbol of the war's contradictions. On one side of the walls, death and destruction. On the inside, fragile hope that even amidst ruin, compassion could survive. The nurses realized that their captors' true power did not lie only in tanks and planes, but in their refusal to surrender humanity. The Americans could have turned the hospital into a cage. Instead, they made it into a sanctuary of necessity and mercy. By dawn, the once prisoners were no longer thinking of themselves as captives, but as healers again. They had not been spared from the war, but they had been pulled from its darkest illusions. In the days that followed, word spread through other units, through other captured medical staff. The Americans had not only captured German territory, they had captured the very spirit of those who served life over death. For the nurses, disbelief slowly turned into a grim respect. The enemy they feared had shown them something their own leaders never had, that even in war, humanity is not weakness, it is strength. And as the sun rose over the shattered fields of Bavaria, the nurses who once prepared for humiliation now tied bandages with steady hands, their eyes no longer clouded with fear, but sharpened with resolve. For the first time in years they were free, not free from captivity, but free to be what they had always wanted to be, healers. By the spring of 1945, Europe was a continent carved into ruins. The Reich, once swollen with ambition, was now collapsing beneath the relentless weight of Allied armies pressing in from every direction. To the east, the Red Army surged like a tidal wave across the plains of Poland, crashing toward Berlin with unrelenting fury. To the west, American and British forces had broken through the Rhine, the very river Hitler once proclaimed impassable. The skies, once guarded by the Luftwaffe, now belonged almost entirely to Allied bombers and fighters. The German dream of domination had shriveled into a nightmare of desperation. Yet in the chaos of this dying empire, small details of human struggle would echo louder than the thunder of artillery. In towns and villages across Bavaria, the people understood the war was lost. Food was scarce, morale shattered, and rumors of atrocities committed by both sides filled the air like a poisonous fog. Soldiers who had once marched with iron pride now limped through the countryside, dazed, broken, searching only for survival. But amidst this crumbling order, one group carried a unique burden, the women who served as military nurses. They had sworn themselves to the care of wounded soldiers, men who now arrived in endless waves, broken by tank shells, shredded by machine gun fire, burned by flamethrowers. The Reich had demanded much of them. Beyond the antiseptic smell of hospitals, beyond the neat rows of beds, there was an unspoken expectation, loyalty. These women were not just healers. They were soldiers in their own way, sworn to serve the fatherland. Their uniforms bore insignias, their records were stamped by military officers, and though they had taken oaths to preserve life, they had done so under a flag that glorified sacrifice and death. To deviate, to hesitate, was treason. Their work was twisted into the machinery of total war. But the Americans, advancing deeper into Germany, brought with them a doctrine unlike anything the nurses had been taught to expect. The United States Army Medical Department had long been drilled in the Geneva Conventions. insisting that care for the wounded transcended national identity. To them, a man bleeding on a stretcher was not first a German or an American, not a Nazi or a liberator, but simply a human being in need. And so when they encountered the German nurses, uniformed, frightened, certain they would be condemned, they saw not enemies, but professionals who could be harnessed to preserve life rather than end it. The broader war situation magnified the irony. In those final months, Hitler had ordered his people into a suicidal defense, mobilizing children and the elderly in the Volkssturm, declaring that every German must fight to the last breath. Cities were commanded to resist even as bombs leveled them. Yet within this apocalyptic vision, the Americans cut across with a strategy that was almost surgical. Their advance was swift, but their handling of occupied zones was deliberate. Hospitals were not burned, but converted. Captured medical staff were not slaughtered, but directed. The contrast could not have been sharper. In this clash of doctrines, the nurses became unwilling symbols of two opposing worlds. On one side, the German system, which demanded loyalty to ideology above humanity, where healing was only a tool of the state. On the other, the American system, which saw healing as a universal necessity, a responsibility that could not be extinguished even in war's darkest hours. The war had prepared them for brutality. Propaganda films showed American soldiers as barbarians, men who would defile and destroy. This narrative was drilled so deeply that many German women prepared suicide pills as the enemy approached, certain that capture meant dishonor worse than death. When American tanks finally rolled through their towns, the expectation was not of mercy, but of vengeance. And yet the reality broke every illusion. For the American commanders, there was a practical reason as well. Their own medical corps was stretched thin across a battlefield that spanned hundreds of miles. Supplies, though abundant compared to the starving German army, were still finite. Every nurse captured was a resource, a skilled professional who could ease the burden. To waste such knowledge out of hatred was unthinkable. This was war, yes, but war fought with an eye toward the future. Victory was not simply measured in destroyed cities, but in the preservation of order after the guns fell silent, and order required hospitals, medicine, and the hands of healers. Meanwhile, the Germans watched in disbelief. Their officers, if still alive, fumed at the humiliation, their own nurses, taking direction from Americans. It was another fracture in the crumbling edifice of Nazi pride. Reports filtered back through captured soldiers that in these occupied hospitals, nurses who once tended only to the Wehrmacht were now binding the wounds of men in olive drab. It was a psychological wound deeper than any bayonet thrust, a revelation that the Reich no longer controlled its own servants of mercy. To the nurses themselves, the shift was agonizing yet strangely liberating. For years they had worked under the iron gaze of Nazi ideology, binding wounds not for humanity, but for the machine of war. Every bandage, every transfusion, was another soldier sent back to the front to kill. Their skills had been twisted into weapons. Now in American custody, they found a paradoxical kind of freedom. Their captors did not care about loyalty to Hitler. They cared only about life and death. The weight of ideology lifted, replaced by a purer duty to save whoever lay before them. As news of Germany's imminent defeat spread, as rumors of Hitler's paranoia and Berlin's collapse reached their ears, the nurses began to sense the ground shifting beneath them. The Reich that had consumed their youth was dissolving. The faces of the wounded they tended were not symbols of ideology anymore, but individuals, frightened, pained, fragile. Whether in field hospitals near Nuremberg, makeshift clinics in the Black Forest, or captured barracks converted into aid stations, the pattern repeated itself. The Americans took what had been a weaponized medical corps and transformed it into something closer to its original purpose. This broader context mattered, for history would remember the tanks, the battles, the general strategies. But beneath the thunder of artillery, the quieter revolution was unfolding in tents and wards across occupied Germany. The confrontation between propaganda and reality, between doctrine and humanity, was playing out in the hands of German nurses, who found themselves ordered to do the impossible, to serve the enemy by saving lives. And in doing so they revealed something deeper about the war itself, that even in its last convulsions, there remained space for mercy, for compassion, for the stubborn insistence that life mattered more than death. For the Americans, This was not charity alone. It was strategy, psychological, political, moral. Every bandage tied by a German nurse under their supervision was a signal to the local population. The warlords had lost, but humanity had not. Every suture was a quiet assurance that the new occupiers were not conquerors alone, but custodians of life in the ruins. And for the nurses, each moment became a revelation, a dismantling of years of lies. The Americans did not humiliate them, as they had been taught to fear. Instead, they honored their training, and in that honor they planted seeds of doubt about everything the Reich had demanded of them. Thus, in the spring of 1945, the war's greater story unfolded not only in Berlin's ruins or on the Elbe where East met West, but also in the quiet, hidden places in hospitals where German nurses discovered that captivity did not mean degradation but duty reborn. April 1945. Across the shattered landscape of southern Germany, the Wehrmacht was collapsing in on itself. Town after town fell in quick succession, their defenders either surrendering en masse or retreating into the mountains in a last, desperate bid to delay the inevitable. For the men of the U.S. 7th Army, every mile gained was both a victory and a burden. They were fighting not only the remnants of an enemy army, but also the heavy toll of exhaustion, supply strains, and the ceaseless arrival of their own wounded. It was here, amid the ruins of farmhouses and the smoke of burning convoys, that the hidden advantage of the American approach to war revealed itself, and to the astonishment of their captives, it was not firepower alone, it was medicine. When the German nurses were first seized, fear held them immobile. They expected cruelty, mockery, even violation. Instead, they were handed gloves and instruments. The message was startlingly clear. Their work was not over, but the work was transformed. No longer were they patching up men, only to be hurled back into the inferno of hopeless battles. No longer were they obeying orders steeped in ideology. The Americans placed before them a new task: save lives, regardless of uniform. This, the Germans could hardly comprehend. The hidden advantage lay not merely in the fact that the Americans spared them, but in the philosophy that underpinned it. The U.S. Army's doctrine of battlefield medicine had, from the very beginning of the war, been designed with pragmatism and humanity in equal measure. Mobile field hospitals, rapid evacuation routes, and the widespread use of blood plasma transfusions meant that an American soldier's odds of survival were far greater than those of his German counterpart. Now, with the Reich collapsing, that system extended beyond their own troops. The Germans were not merely conquered, they were reabsorbed into a system where life itself was prioritized. To the nurses, the shock was profound. For years they had lived under a regime that glorified death. Hitler's speeches declared that only those willing to sacrifice all were worthy of the fatherland. The cult of the fallen soldier permeated every ceremony, every parade, every poster. Yet here the Americans revealed a very different truth, that the real strength of an army was not in how many men it could sacrifice, but in how many it could save. The first time the German nurses were asked to treat an American soldier, hesitation nearly broke them. One nurse, her hands trembling, reached for a bandage to dress the wound of a private whose chest had been torn open by shrapnel. She expected curses, perhaps a blow, some signal that she was unwelcome. Instead, the wounded man simply groaned, his eyes clouded by pain. He did not see an enemy tending him. He saw only relief. In that moment, the nurse realized she had been given back her profession. She was no longer a cog in Hitler's war machine. She was a healer again. For the Americans, this was no sentimental gesture. It was a tactical advantage, a form of psychological warfare more powerful than leaflets or loudspeakers. By compelling German nurses to continue their duties, the Americans undermined years of Nazi indoctrination. They demonstrated in the most tangible way possible that the Reich had lied. The enemy was not here to humiliate them. The enemy was here to restore what their own leaders had corrupted. Word of this spread like wildfire. Captured soldiers whispered of it in prison camps, that the Americans ordered nurses to treat their wounded with the same care as their own. For men who had been told that capture meant starvation and brutality, this revelation was destabilizing. Doubt crept in, seeding cracks in morale far deeper than any artillery barrage could achieve. If the Americans respected even their nurses, could they truly be the monsters propaganda claimed? Meanwhile, the nurses found themselves in an unexpected position of influence. Within the confines of the field hospitals, they became bridges between the defeated and the victors. Their very presence, grey uniforms working alongside olive drab, was a visual contradiction, a living testament that the war's rigid lines of us versus them were breaking down. They were living proof that cooperation was possible, even as battles raged only miles away. The Germans could not understand it at first. Why would the Americans permit this? Why allow the enemy to retain dignity, to continue practicing their craft? The answer was simple yet revolutionary, because to the Americans preserving dignity was part of winning the peace. Every life saved was not only a soldier rescued from death, but a demonstration that their system built on logistics, humanity and respect was stronger than the Reich's cult of destruction. For the nurses, disbelief turned to something more complex. At first it was suspicion, then astonishment, then a hesitant respect. They realized that they were not being used as tools of mockery, but as professionals whose skills transcended politics. In a war where so much had been twisted, where science and medicine had been warped into instruments of cruelty, this recognition was disorienting. It was also liberating. One nurse later recalled how she treated a line of American infantrymen suffering burns from a half-destroyed fuel truck. She was given ointments, gauze and morphine by US medics who stood beside her, guiding her with quiet authority. For the first time in years, she admitted, "I was not working for a flag, I was working for life." That sentiment, whispered in the quiet of a canvas tent, carried the weight of a battlefield victory. The hidden advantage, then, was not only the overwhelming firepower of Sherman's or the endless skies filled with American bombers, it was the moral high ground, made manifest in the most unlikely of places in the steady hands of German nurses compelled to heal under the watchful eyes of their captors. It was a reminder to the defeated that the Americans were not conquerors bent on annihilation, but guardians of a principle far more enduring than territory: compassion. The Germans had built their war machine on fear, on domination, on a narrative that life was expendable for the sake of ideology. The Americans, in contrast, revealed a system where life itself was the foundation of strength, and in that revelation lay a devastating psychological blow. For how could the Reich claim superiority when its enemies proved more faithful to the very essence of humanity? Night after night, under lantern light and the distant echo of artillery, the nurses came to grips with this new reality. Captives they might be, but slaves they were not. In their enforced duty they found a freedom their own leaders had long denied them. They could save again, heal again, reclaim the essence of their profession. The Americans had taken what the Reich had corrupted and given it back, reshaped not as propaganda, but as truth. This, more than anything, was the hidden advantage. It was not just weapons, not just radios or tanks. It was the refusal to let war extinguish humanity. And as German nurses bowed their heads over stretchers and wounds, they could not escape the realization their captors were teaching them a lesson their own nation had forgotten, that in war the greatest power does not lie in how effectively you destroy, but in how steadfastly you preserve. Steel tables clattered under the weight of instruments. Glass bottles of antiseptic rattled with each distant concussion of artillery. In the flickering glow of lanterns, the technical heart of medicine in war revealed itself, an arsenal of tools as crucial as rifles and tanks. To the German nurses now serving under American command, the transformation was staggering. They were suddenly surrounded by equipment and supplies their own hospitals had not seen in months, perhaps years. Morphine ampoules stacked neatly in metal cases. Bandages white and clean instead of yellowed scraps torn from bed linens. Plasma transfusion kits gleaming with tubes and glass. This was not merely a shift in captors, it was a revelation of technological superiority. The Americans fought war with logistics as much as with bullets. Their medical corps, backed by the vast industrial might of Detroit and Chicago, delivered innovations that changed the odds of survival. German nurses, trained in improvisation born of scarcity, found themselves handling equipment that seemed almost miraculous. They had grown used to scrounging for supplies, sterilizing needles over camp stoves, and cutting uniforms into strips for bandages. Now they were issued boxes of sulfur drugs, cartons of surgical gloves, and transfusion sets designed for speed. What had once been a desperate guessing game of survival became a procedure. One item stood out above all: The plasma unit. Developed early in the war, American doctors and chemists had perfected a system of drying human blood plasma so that it could be shipped across oceans without spoilage. Reconstituted with sterile water, it brought the chance of life to men who had lost too much blood to survive otherwise. The Germans, by contrast, still relied heavily on direct transfusions and small, fragile reserves. In tent hospitals across Bavaria, the German nurses watched in awe as American medics inserted needles, connected tubes, and hung bags of life-saving fluid. For the first time, the women realized they were witnessing the future of battlefield medicine. It was not just the plasma. The Americans equipped their hospitals with radios tuned specifically for medical coordination. Each field station was tied into a network, able to call for supplies, request ambulances, or even summon surgical teams with precision. By contrast, German medical stations often operated in isolation, cut off by destroyed roads or broken lines of communication. The fog radios available to German units were limited, vulnerable to interference, and never prioritized for medical units. The difference was not just technical, it was philosophical. The Americans believed survival depended on connection, and their technology reflected it. The nurses began to notice the rhythm of the American system. Wounded men arrived not in scattered trickles, as they were used to, but in organized waves. Ambulances roared up with stretchers already labeled, triage tags pinned to uniforms. Each patient carried a paper note, scrawled with vital signs, injuries and times. It was methodical, mechanical, yet undeniably humane. In contrast, the German evacuation system had crumbled with the Reich itself. Horse-drawn wagons carried the broken back from the front, hours or days too late. Men who might have lived with proper evacuation died in transit. Even the instruments themselves spoke of a different world. The Americans carried surgical kits designed for mobility, compact rolls containing scalpels, clamps, forceps, and scissors made with industrial precision. They issued autoclaves, portable sterilizers powered by gasoline burners so that instruments could be cleaned quickly even in the field. German nurses, by contrast, had spent months reusing the same tools, often forced to scrub them in cold water, and prey infection did not claim the patient before the bullet wound did. To handle an American scalpel was to feel the weight of an empire's factories condensed into the palm of the hand. The technical differences went deeper. The Americans relied heavily on sulfonamide powders, sprinkled directly into wounds to prevent infection. Though both sides had access to this discovery, the United States mass-produced it on a scale Germany could no longer dream of by 1945. While German surgeons rationed their last tins, the Americans handed out packets like salt. The nurses could hardly believe it. What had been a guarded treasure under the Reich was now scattered freely across every cot, every bandage, every gash. For the engineers and logisticians behind the front, these details were not glamorous. They did not roar like engines or thunder like artillery. Yet in their quiet efficiency lay a decisive advantage. German generals boasted of Tiger tanks, of jet fighters, of V-weapons streaking across the sky. The Americans quietly invested in plasma, radios, and ambulances. And in the end, these humble innovations saved more lives than any weapon could destroy. The nurses themselves became instruments of this technical superiority. Trained under a system that prized endurance over equipment, they were now thrust into a network where tools mattered as much as skill. At first, they fumbled with the American devices, uncertain of protocols, but under the guidance of US medics, they adapted quickly. Their hands, once stiffened by habit, learned new motions, securing transfusion lines, calibrating radio calls, adjusting morphine doses by the American standard. They were captives, yes, but they were also apprentices in a system more advanced than anything they had known. The sheer abundance of supplies stunned them. Crates stamped with US Army Medical Department were unloaded daily. Gauze, dressings, anesthetics, antiseptics, more than they could have imagined. In Germany, bombed factories and blockaded ports had left hospitals starved. Nurses cut rags from curtains to bind wounds. Ether for anesthesia was rationed to a drop. Now they walked among mountains of provisions, a stark reminder that industrial might was as decisive as battlefield bravery. The Reich had built wonders of engineering, tanks that terrified, rockets that astonished, but it had failed to build the foundation of survival. And perhaps the most jarring technical revelation of all, the Americans expected the nurses to use these resources freely. No lectures on conservation, no reprimands for wasting the fatherland's supplies. Each bandage applied, each dose administered, was met with approval. For women conditioned to treat medicine as treasure, this was almost incomprehensible. Here life itself was considered worth the cost. As days turned into weeks, the German nurses began to understand the scope of the hidden advantage. It was not only radios or plasma, not only factories or logistics, it was a worldview, encoded into every instrument and every order. A worldview that declared war could be fought without abandoning humanity, that technology's highest calling was not destruction but preservation. In the silence between shell bursts, in the glow of lanterns over steel tables, the truth became undeniable. The Americans had not simply defeated Germany with tanks and planes, they had outbuilt, outplanned and outcared them. The German nurses, once soldiers of a regime obsessed with death, now handled the tools of a system devoted to life, and in those sterile metal instruments, in those clean white bandages, they touched the very essence of why the Reich had lost. September 19, 1944. The Lorraine region of France lay shrouded in mist, its fields torn apart by weeks of battle. The village of Aracourt smouldered in ruin, the air thick with the acrid stench of burned fuel and cordite. To the west, American May-18 Hellcats prowled through the fog, their engines growling like hunting predators. To the east, German Panthers advanced in disciplined lines, their armor glistening with dew, their commanders confident that raw firepower would crush the enemy. The stage was set for one of the strangest and most telling clashes of the war, a battle where German strength was undermined not by sheer firepower, but by speed, communication, and a philosophy of survival. In the early hours, the Germans struck hard. Panthers pushed through the fields, their 75 high-velocity cannons snarling as shells screamed toward American positions. Houses collapsed under impact, trees exploded into splinters. But the Americans did not crumble. Their Hellcats, lighter, faster, and armed with superior radios, slipped in and out of the fog like phantoms. To the Germans it seemed impossible. Tanks this light should have been slaughtered in open combat. Yet every time a Panther advanced, it was ambushed from the flank, its armor pierced by a well-placed shot. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, the Hellcats vanished into the haze. Inside the command posts, German officers fumed. Reports came in fragmented and confusing. Panthers destroyed, crews shaken, visibility near zero. Radio messages crackled with static, each commander isolated from the next. They could not understand how the Americans coordinated so fluidly. To the German nurses stationed in nearby field hospitals, the aftermath was a grim spectacle. Ambulances brought in scores of wounded men, their uniforms blackened by smoke, their voices hoarse with disbelief. They spoke of an enemy that moved like water, impossible to pin down, impossible to predict. The Americans, however, knew the truth. Their advantage lay not in the Hellcat's armor, paper-thin compared to the Panthers, but in its speed and its connection. Every unit carried FM radios, crisp and reliable even in the fog. Crews called out enemy positions, relayed flank maneuvers, and directed artillery with precision. In contrast, the Germans relied on AM sets prone to interference, their communications splintered and confused. Superior steel could not save them from inferior coordination. The German nurses worked through the night, their hands stained with blood, as stretcher after stretcher was carried inside. Limbs shattered, faces burned, lungs rattling with smoke. They stitched, they bandaged, they prayed, their uniforms soaked through with sweat and tears. But what they could not mend was the morale of the men they treated. Panther crews who had once believed in the invincibility of their tanks, now muttered in shock. They were everywhere at once, one whispered, his eyes wide with terror. We never saw them coming. Aracourt was not just a tactical loss. It was a psychological blow that rippled through the German ranks. Their mightiest machines had been humiliated by lighter, faster foes. Their doctrine of armored superiority lay in ruins, dismantled not by brute force but by an unseen advantage hidden in the airwaves. And through it all the nurses bore silent witness. They listened as officers muttered curses about faulty radios, as soldiers cursed their commanders for sending them blind into the fog. The lesson was undeniable. German steel meant little when German voices could not reach one another. In the days that followed, the pattern repeated itself. At hilltop skirmishes, in valleys choked with smoke, American units struck with uncanny coordination. German counterattacks, furious but fragmented, collapsed under the weight of confusion. For the nurses, the war became a relentless cycle of patching broken bodies, only to watch them return shattered again. But even they began to see the larger truth, that their nation's war machine, once feared across the world, was cracking from within. The Americans did not fight clean battles. They fought smart ones. They used deception, camouflage, and rapid strikes. They pulled back when pressed, regrouped, and struck from another direction. To German eyes, raised on doctrines of discipline and rigid formation, this seemed chaotic, even dishonorable. But to the men lying in blood-soaked cots, it was devastatingly effective. The Reich's vaunted panzers, symbols of unstoppable might, were being undone not by stronger armor, but by quicker thinking. At Aracourt, the final tally was devastating. 39 German panthers rolled into the mist. By the battle's end, most lay smoldering wrecks, their hulks blackened against the grey horizon. American losses were far fewer, their lighter vehicles darting away before serious damage could be inflicted. For the nurses, this meant a flood of German casualties overwhelming their wards. They worked without pause, exhaustion etching lines into their faces. Yet as they bound wounds, they heard whispers of despair. The Americans knew where we were before we moved. How? The truth lay in technology and doctrine, but also in philosophy. The Americans fought to preserve their men, to save as many lives as possible, and their system reflected that: rapid evacuation, mobile medicine, abundant supplies, each soldier was valued. The Germans, by contrast, treated their men as expendable. Reinforcements could always be drafted, losses always replaced, until at last they could not. And the nurses knew this truth in their bones. They had seen too many men sent back to the front, only to return broken beyond repair. In Aracourt's aftermath, the field hospitals themselves became symbols of contrast. American tents bustled with organized efficiency, plasma transfusions saving men who would otherwise have died. German wards, starved of supplies, echoed with the cries of men dying from treatable wounds. And in the middle stood the nurses, witnesses to both worlds. They could no longer ignore the evidence before their eyes. Their enemy valued life more than their own leaders did. As autumn gave way to winter, the Battle of Aracourt became legend among American troops, and a bitter memory among German veterans. But for the nurses who dressed the wounds, who watched life slip away beneath their hands, it was something more. It was a revelation of futility. The Reich's proud machines, its vaunted doctrine, its endless demands for sacrifice, all were meaningless before an enemy that fought with brains and compassion in equal measure. In the end, Aracourt was not just a battle of tanks, it was a battle of philosophies, and the nurses, trapped between defeat and duty, saw the truth written in every wound they tended. The war was lost, not only because the Allies had more men and machines, but because they fought with a hidden strength Germany had long abandoned. In the weeks after Aracourt, the ripples of shock traveled far beyond the smoking hulks of destroyed panthers. German officers, once certain of their superiority, found themselves grasping for explanations. Reports filed from the front carried a tone of disbelief. Enemy tanks vanishing into fog, artillery landing with uncanny precision, attacks coordinated with a fluidity the Wehrmacht could not match. In every command post, questions swirled. Was this sorcery? Espionage? Some secret weapon unseen? The truth was simpler, yet far more devastating. The Americans had built an army that could adapt, react, and communicate at every level, while the German war machine was beginning to collapse under its own rigidity. For the nurses working in the aftermath, the impact was visible not just in the wounds but in the faces of the men they tended. Soldiers arrived not merely broken in body but fractured in spirit. They muttered of commanders who gave orders too late, of reinforcements that never came, of radios that spat only static when clarity was needed most. Again and again they asked the same question: why could the enemy always respond faster? And each time the answer revealed itself in the grim silence of their caretakers. The Americans had created a system where even if a leader fell, the unit carried on. In Germany, when a commander's tank was destroyed, the platoon collapsed with it. This disparity was not only technical, it was psychological. German troops had been raised on the cult of the Führer, on obedience to hierarchy so strict that initiative was strangled. Orders flowed downward like iron chains. When the links broke, the machine froze. By contrast, the Americans operated on a doctrine that valued initiative, where even sergeants could redirect entire squads if conditions changed. Radios empowered this freedom, knitting units together in a web that refused to unravel. The difference crushed German morale as surely as any bombardment. For the nurses, the contrast was even starker inside the hospitals. American medics treated their wounded with speed, efficiency, and a sense of dignity. Each soldier was catalogued, his injuries carefully recorded, his treatment prioritized. Germans, meanwhile, often arrived with nothing, no records, no tags, no notes. Chaos reigned, leaving nurses to guess, to improvise, to do their best with scraps of information. They envied the Americans' order, but they also envied the sense of value given to each life. In their own system, death was expected, even embraced as sacrifice. In the American one, every death was considered a failure to be prevented. The psychological toll deepened with every passing day. Captured soldiers heard rumors that American wounded were evacuated by air, carried on C-47 transport planes turned into flying hospitals. The thought was almost fantastical. A wounded man whisked above the clouds, his life suspended by altitude and technology, returned safely to England or even the United States. To German ears it was science fiction. For the nurses who overheard these whispers, it was a revelation of just how little their leaders valued survival. Their own wounded often died on straw in the backs of wagons, dragged for miles across bomb-pocked roads. And so, under captivity, something remarkable began to occur. The German nurses, still prisoners, began to see their work not as humiliation, but as vindication. For years they had longed to heal without ideology, to save without being complicit in the machinery of destruction. Now, under the Americans, they were finally allowed to fulfill that desire. Their captors asked nothing of them but skill and compassion. The Reich had demanded their loyalty. The Americans demanded their humanity. It was a demand they were more than willing to meet. The strategic impact went beyond hospitals. Each nurse who served under American direction became a symbol to her own people. Civilians, terrified of occupation, saw their daughters and sisters in uniform still practicing their craft, not degraded, not dishonored, but treated with respect. This eroded fear faster than propaganda ever could. If the Americans valued even their captives, perhaps surrender was not the abyss the Reich had warned of, perhaps life after defeat was possible. In this way, medicine became a weapon sharper than steel. The Americans wielded it with quiet mastery, undermining Nazi narratives without firing a shot. German officers could rage about betrayal, about dishonor, but the proof was undeniable. Their own nurses had been captured, and instead of being silenced, they were healing under the enemy's flag. Each bandaged wound, each life preserved was a silent blow against the myth of Allied brutality. The Reich had lost control not only of its armies but of its story. Psychologically, the effect on the nurses themselves was profound. Years of indoctrination began to crumble. They remembered the faces of professors in nursing schools, the lectures on the sanctity of life, lessons buried beneath propaganda. Those voices returned to them now, stronger than ever, reminding them that their true duty was not to Hitler, not to flags or borders, but to the fragile heartbeat under their hands. Every time they tied a suture on an American soldier, they reclaimed a piece of themselves long suppressed. And for the Americans, the benefits multiplied. The nurses were experienced, disciplined and invaluable in the grueling work of triage, but their presence also offered something intangible, proof that the enemy's spirit could be bent without breaking. These women were not collaborators in the traditional sense. They were captives. Yet in their service they demonstrated a simple truth: survival and compassion transcended politics. To the GIs who watched them work, it was a reassurance that humanity persisted even among their foes. To the German wounded, it was a reminder that mercy was not dead. The broader strategic picture reflected this. As the Americans pushed deeper into Bavaria, their reputation preceded them. Civilians surrendered towns without resistance, convinced by stories of hospitals where German nurses continued to heal. Soldiers laid down arms rather than fight to the death, unwilling to believe anymore that capture meant annihilation. The Reich's grip on its people loosened, not just under the weight of bombs and tanks, but under the weight of truth. For the nurses themselves, the psychological transformation was irreversible. They could never again believe the lies that had been fed to them. They had seen too much. They had witnessed American soldiers weep with gratitude as their wounds were bound, heard thank you in halting German or broken English, felt respect in the way medics shared their tools without suspicion. It was not weakness, it was strength of a kind their own leaders had abandoned. Thus, the strategic and psychological impact of their captivity was twofold. For Germany, it was a shattering blow to morale, proof that their propaganda had been hollow all along. For America, it was a quiet triumph, an advantage born not of destruction but of preservation. And for the nurses, it was liberation of a kind they had never expected, freedom found not in escape but in the restoration of their calling. War had taught them to expect cruelty. Instead, they found purpose, and that, more than any battle or bombardment, was the blow from which the Reich would never recover. The guns finally fell silent on May 8, 1945. In the ruins of Berlin, the Reich lay dead, its banners torn down, its leaders either captured or gone to dust. Across Europe, bells rang, soldiers embraced, civilians wept with relief and disbelief. Yet in the quiet corners of field hospitals and makeshift clinics, the legacy of the war revealed itself not only in ruins but in hands that had chosen against all odds to heal. Among those hands were the German nurses who had once feared captivity, only to discover that their enemy demanded not their humiliation, but their humanity. For them, the war's end was not a clean break. Many remained under Allied supervision for weeks or months, continuing their work in occupied territories. They dressed wounds in the same tents where artillery fire had echoed only days earlier. They assisted American medics in caring for prisoners of war, civilians caught in the crossfire, even survivors of concentration camps, who stumbled into the light of liberation. In their captivity, they found themselves more free than they had ever been under the Reich. Their oaths, long buried beneath ideology, were finally honored. This legacy stretched far beyond individual acts of mercy. It became part of the greater lesson the war carved into history, that the true strength of an army lies not in the tanks it fields or the shells it fires, but in the values it carries forward. German engineers had given the world marvels of steel, the Tiger tank, the jet fighter, the V-2 rocket. But their leaders had chained these marvels to a philosophy of destruction, consuming lives as recklessly as they consumed fuel. The Americans, by contrast, had forged a different kind of power. They had shown that to save was stronger than to destroy, that to preserve life was not weakness but the very essence of victory. The nurses could not forget what they had seen. They remembered the abundance of American supplies, the precision of their triage, the compassion with which they treated even enemy wounded. They remembered how a US medic had handed them morphine without hesitation, how a wounded GI whispered thank you in their own tongue. These memories would outlive the Reich, etched into their identities like scars. When they returned home, they carried with them a quiet truth, that the world was larger than the lies they had been told, that mercy had no borders, that dignity survived even in captivity. The Allies, too, carried lessons from these encounters. In the post-war years, as armies restructured and nations prepared for a new kind of conflict, the philosophy of networked warfare took root. Radios and rapid evacuation became the cornerstone of modern armies. Blood plasma transfusions, pioneered in the chaos of the 1940s, evolved into mobile trauma units and medevac helicopters in Korea and Vietnam. The legacy of those Bavarian field hospitals lived on in every battlefield where survival depended on speed, connection, and care. Even in the Cold War, the lesson endured. NATO forces, shaped by the American model, built doctrines where communication outweighed isolation, where soldiers could trust that their lives mattered as much as the mission. The Soviets, inheriting the German obsession with mass and firepower, never fully grasped the moral strength that came from valuing every soldier as irreplaceable. And when wars of the late 20th century erupted, in the Gulf, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, the echoes of 1945 were unmistakable. Armies no longer measured success only in territory seized, but in how swiftly they could save their wounded, how seamlessly they could coordinate across the chaos of battle. For the nurses themselves, history recorded little. Their names faded into the anonymity of post-war Europe, their stories buried beneath rubble and reconstruction. Yet their legacy was profound. They had entered captivity expecting degradation, only to discover purpose. They had been soldiers of a state that demanded loyalty to death, only to serve under an enemy that demanded loyalty to life. And in that paradox, they discovered the war's greatest irony, that their true liberation came not with the collapse of the Reich, but with the command to heal under American eyes. Generals wrote memoirs of strategy. Politicians declared victory in speeches. Engineers boasted of tanks and rockets. But the nurses carried the quieter truth, the truth that the war had been decided not only in battles like Aracourt or the Ardennes, but in the wards where life itself was preserved against all odds. In every stitch they tied, every transfusion they administered, every sigh of relief from a soldier who lived, they revealed the lesson carved deepest into the ashes of Europe, that connection outweighed firepower, and compassion outlasted cruelty. In time, the world moved on. Germany rebuilt. The Marshall Plan poured steel and hope into cities reduced to rubble, and the Cold War cast its long shadow across the globe. But somewhere in Bavaria, in memory if not in stone, a canvas hospital once stood where captives became healers again, and where mercy was the sharpest weapon of all. In the end, the story of the German nurses in captivity was not merely about shock or disbelief. It was about revelation. They could not believe at first that the Americans wanted them to save lives, but once they accepted it, they became part of a legacy larger than themselves. Their hands stitched together more than torn flesh. They stitched together the first fragile thread in a broken continent. War had tried to strip them of their humanity. Captivity gave it back. And in the quiet after the guns, that truth remained: the greatest victories are not measured in cities conquered or enemies destroyed, but in lives preserved when all hope seemed lost.